On November 26, 1941, a massive Japanese naval strike force quietly slipped away from the coast of Japan. Comprising 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, and hundreds of aircraft, it began its long, secret voyage across the Pacific Ocean. Their mission was to assemble at a rendezvous point roughly 230 miles north of the Hawaiian island of Oahu. Their target, the United States Pacific Fleet, anchored at Pearl Harbor. The attack was scheduled for December 7, 1941. If successful, it would strike the Americans completely off guard, crippling their fleet for months and costing thousands of lives. Yet while the attack achieved momentary success, it would also alter the course of World War II and ultimately lead to the collapse of Imperial Japan itself. But why did Japan attack Pearl Harbor at all? What drove its leaders to take such an enormous risk? And how did their miscalculations ensure their eventual defeat? To understand that, we must journey back to the turbulent 1930s, a decade that reshaped Japan's destiny. Japan's rise and its imperial ambitions. In the early 20th century, Japan had transformed itself from a secluded island nation into a rapidly industrializing power. Since the Meiji Restoration in the late 1800s, Japan had modernized its economy, its infrastructure, and most importantly, its military. It aspired to stand shoulder to shoulder with the world's great empires, Britain, France, and the United States, and to forge an empire of its own across Asia and the Pacific. Japan's leaders envisioned an empire that would provide the raw materials, labor, and markets needed to sustain industrial growth and secure national power. However, there was one enormous obstacle standing in their way. Japan itself lacked nearly all the key natural resources required to fuel an empire. The home islands produced little coal, iron, or oil, all vital ingredients of modern warfare and industry. To achieve its imperial dreams, Japan would have to take those resources by force. The invasion of Manchuria and the war in China. The first major step in Japan's imperial campaign came in 1931, when its military seized Manchuria, a resource-rich region in northeastern China. The invasion provided Japan with access to coal, iron, and agricultural land, as well as a strategic foothold on the Asian continent. It also marked the beginning of Japan's transformation into an aggressive imperial power. Over the next few years, Japan expanded further into northern China. Tensions between Japanese and Chinese troops escalated until, in July 1937, full-scale war erupted, the Second Sino-Japanese War. Initially, Japan's military achieved swift victories. Cities like Shanghai, Beijing, and Nanjing fell in rapid succession. Yet Japan's triumphs were stained by horrific atrocities. During the infamous Rape of Nanking, Japanese forces slaughtered tens of thousands of civilians and prisoners of war, acts that drew global outrage and condemnation. By 1939, the war had ground into a brutal stalemate. China refused to surrender, and Japan found itself bogged down in a conflict that consumed enormous amounts of manpower, weapons, and supplies. Its military successes could not mask the growing strain on its economy. If Japan wanted to sustain the war and its ambitions, it needed a new source of resources. Yet American isolationism and growing concern across the Pacific, the United States observed Japan's expansion with increasing alarm. Yet after the trauma of World War I, most Americans wanted nothing to do with another foreign war. The U.S. adopted a policy of isolationism, seeking to avoid entanglements in overseas conflicts. In the 1930s, Congress passed a series of neutrality acts designed to keep the country out of war. These laws prohibited selling arms to nations at war and restricted U.S. citizens from traveling on belligerent ships. America's policy was simple: stay neutral, stay safe. But as the decade progressed, isolationism became harder to maintain. Adolf Hitler's aggression in Europe and Japan's atrocities in China made it clear that the world was heading toward another global conflict. Gradually, public opinion began to shift. When Franklin D. Roosevelt became president, he recognized that total neutrality might ultimately endanger America. In 1939, Congress passed a revised Neutrality Act, allowing the U.S. to sell weapons to Britain and France. Under a cash-and-carry system, they could buy supplies if they paid up front and transported them themselves. By 1941, Roosevelt had gone even further, approving the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed the United States to send weapons, food, and supplies to any country vital to its defense, including China and the Soviet Union. Though America remained officially neutral, it was obvious whose side it favored. To Japan, this was a clear warning and a major obstacle. Planes would be grounded, its ships immobilized, and its industry crippled. In essence, Japan's dreams of empire depended on the goodwill of a nation that increasingly viewed it as a threat. This dependency placed Japan in a dangerous position. Its military leaders knew that if America ever decided to cut off oil shipments, Japan's ability to wage war, or even defend itself, would collapse within months. To the northern and southern strategies. As the resource crisis worsened, Japan's leaders debated two competing strategies for expansion. The northern strategy, championed by the Imperial Japanese Army, aimed at conquering resource-rich Siberia and Mongolia by attacking the Soviet Union. In contrast, the southern strategy, backed by the Imperial Navy, called for seizing the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, and the Philippines, regions abundant in oil, rubber, and minerals. By the mid-1930s, Japan had already pursued northern ambitions by moving into Manchuria and northern China, leading to frequent clashes with Soviet forces along the border. These culminated in the Battle of Khalkhin Gol in 1939, where Soviet and Mongolian troops under General Georgy Zhukov dealt Japan a humiliating defeat. The loss shattered Japan's confidence in its northern campaign. Compounded by the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact signed in August 1939, Japan shelved plans to invade Siberia. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, some Japanese officers suggested reviving the northern plan. But Japan was already bogged down in China, short on supplies, and unwilling to risk another costly confrontation. The northern path was abandoned for good. That left only one direction to go: the attack on Pearl Harbor. At 7:55 a.m. on Sunday, December 7, 1941, the first wave of 183 Japanese aircraft appeared in the skies over Oahu. The Americans were caught completely off guard. The attackers were divided into three groups. Two targeted airfields across the island, strafing parked aircraft lined wingtip to wingtip, a precaution against sabotage that made them easy targets. The third group, consisting of bombers and torpedo planes, descended on the ships moored along Battleship Row. American commanders believed Pearl Harbor's shallow waters made torpedo attacks impossible, but Japanese engineers had designed special torpedoes with wooden fins to run in shallow depths, and they proved devastating. Within minutes, explosions tore through the harbor. The USS Oklahoma capsized after multiple hits. The USS Arizona was struck by a bomb that ignited its forward magazine, erupting in a massive explosion that killed 1,177 crewmen. At 8:54 a.m., a second wave of 170 Japanese aircraft attacked. Although U.S. defenses had scrambled to respond, the damage was already catastrophic. By the end of the assault, Japan had sunk or damaged 18 American warships, including all 8 battleships of the Pacific Fleet. 188 aircraft were destroyed, and over 2,400 Americans were killed. Yet, crucially, Japan failed to hit the U.S. aircraft carriers, which were out at sea during the attack. Nor did they target fuel depots or repair facilities, assets that would later prove vital in America's counteroffensive. The wider Japanese offensive, simultaneously, Japan launched a series of coordinated attacks across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Thailand surrendered within hours and joined Japan as an ally. Hong Kong, Malaya, and the Philippines came under fierce assault. 2 major British warships, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, were sunk off the coast of Malaya by Japanese aircraft, the first time capital ships had been destroyed solely by air power. In early 1942, Japan captured Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. Within months, Japan controlled a vast empire stretching from the borders of India to the Pacific Ocean, finally securing the oil, rubber, and raw materials it had long desired. It seemed Japan's gamble had paid off, but beneath the surface, disaster was brewing. The America's response: the sleeping giant awakes. Instead of breaking America's will, the attack on Pearl Harbor had the opposite effect. It united the nation in anger. On December 8, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered his famous Day of Infamy speech, declaring that a date which will live in infamy had thrust the United States into war.
Thousands of Americans are here to cheer the birth of a new era in national affairs, a New Deal era, which is supposed to pull the country out of its chaos.
Within hours, Congress voted overwhelmingly to declare war on Japan. Isolationism vanished overnight. Millions of Americans volunteered for military service. Factories converted to war production at an astonishing pace. The industrial might of the United States, the world's largest economy, was now focused entirely on defeating Japan and its Axis partners. Japan had awakened what Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the very architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had feared most: a sleeping giant filled with a terrible resolve. Conclusion: a fatal miscalculation. The attack on Pearl Harbor was bold, dramatic, and tactically brilliant, but strategically disastrous. Japan's hunger for empire had drawn it into a war it could not win. Its leaders underestimated America's industrial capacity, its morale, and its determination. What they thought would be a short, negotiated war instead became a prolonged struggle that would devastate Japan and end with its surrender in 1945. Pearl Harbor achieved its immediate objective, crippling the Pacific Fleet, but it failed to destroy America's ability to fight back. Within months, the U.S. Navy had recovered, rebuilt, and struck back at Midway, turning the tide of war. In the end, Japan's decision to attack Pearl Harbor did not secure its empire. It sealed its fate. The flames that engulfed the battleships of Pearl Harbor would, 4 years later, return to Japan's own cities in the form of atomic fire.